I always knew my parents favored my brother, but it took me years to understand just how much. Growing up, I convinced myself it wasn't that bad. I thought maybe I was imagining things, overreacting. But the truth was always there, buried under years of small injustices, double standards, and carefully disguised manipulation. I grew up in a small town outside of Denver. On the surface, we looked like a typical middle-class family. My dad worked in finance, my mom was a part-time elementary school teacher, and we lived in a quiet neighborhood where nothing ever really happened. People thought my parents were great, friendly, involved in the community. The kind of people who brought homemade cookies to school events and sent out long-winded Christmas newsletters about how proud they were of their kids. Except, they weren't proud of me. Not really. They were proud of Ethan. Ethan was 3 years younger than me, and from the moment he was born, it was like the entire family existed to protect him. If he messed up, it was someone else's fault. If he failed, it was because the world was unfair. If I ever so much as stumbled, though, it was the end of the world. When I was 16, I got a B in chemistry and was grounded for a month. That same year, Ethan got caught stealing money from my dad's wallet, and my parents just shook their heads and sighed. He's young. He's still learning. That became their excuse for everything. By the time I turned 18, I knew I was on my own. My parents never explicitly told me they wouldn't support me, but they didn't have to. The hints were all there. You'll be paying rent if you stay here after graduation. College is expensive, but you're smart. You'll figure it out. We just want Ethan to have a chance to find himself. Not everyone is as driven as you. So I left. I worked 2 part-time jobs while putting myself through college. I took out loans, ate cheap food, studied until my eyes blurred. My parents never offered to help, not with tuition, not with rent, not with anything. Meanwhile, Ethan dropped out of college after 1 semester because it was too stressful. Instead of pushing him to figure things out, my parents paid his rent for 6 years while he looked for the right job. He went from one failed scheme to another, crypto, flipping sneakers, some shady, consulting business that never took off, and every time, my parents bailed him out. I told myself it didn't bother me. I had my own life, my own goals. I worked my way up in tech, saved my money, bought a house, built something real. I thought maybe one day, my parents would see that they'd finally acknowledge what I had accomplished. They didn't. They only called when they needed something, and what they needed was always the same. Ethan just needs a little help. You're doing so well. He just needs a boost. For years, I let it slide. I gave them money when they asked, paid for things here and there. Let Ethan crash at my place a few times when he was between apartments. Every time, I told myself it was the last time. But it never was. Then, last week, my mom called. And the second I heard her voice, I knew something was wrong. She never calls just to check in. When I answered, she was too cheerful, asking about work, my apartment, even my cat, things she never cared about before. After a few minutes of fake small talk, she got to the point. Ethan is in trouble. Of course he was. But this time, it was worse than I expected. He was $50,000 in debt. Not student loans. Not credit cards. Money he owed to people who don't forget debts. He's scared, my mom said, her voice trembling. They're threatening him. He needs help. You're the only one who can fix this. I felt a chill run down my spine. 50 grand? How does someone even rack up that much debt? How did this happen? I asked. She brushed it off like it didn't matter. That's not important right now. What matters is that he's your brother. Family helps family. That phrase. I had heard it so many times before. When they needed me to cover his rent. When they wanted me to let him stay with me. When they expected me to fix his mistakes, clean up his messes, sacrifice myself for his failures. And every time, I had given in. Because deep down, a part of me still wanted their approval. A part of me still wanted to hear them say they were proud of me. But this was different. 50 grand wasn't a favor. It wasn't a loan. That was a year of my life. A down payment, my safety net, my security. I took a slow breath and said something I had never said to my parents before. No. Silence. Then my mom's voice changed, instantly shifting from pleading to furious. You're being selfish, she snapped. After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us? He's your brother. How can you just turn your back on him? And then came the final blow. What if something happens to him? Do you want his blood on your hands? I gripped the phone tighter. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. The manipulation was so obvious, and yet it still hit me. I almost caved. Almost. But something inside me finally snapped. I'm not responsible for him, I said, my voice steady. If he's in this mess, it's because of his own choices. I'm done. And then I hung up. My hands were shaking. My chest felt tight. But underneath the anger, the guilt, and the fear, there was something else. Relief. For the first time in my life, I had stood my ground. But I knew, this wasn't over. My parents had never taken no for an answer before. And they weren't about to start now. The silence didn't last long. An hour after I hung up, the text started. First from my mom. Long, rambling messages filled with guilt-tripping. I hope you can live with yourself knowing what might happen to your brother. We raised you better than this. I don't know how you became so cold. Then, when I didn't respond, my dad joined in. His texts were shorter, angrier. You're being completely unreasonable. You have the money, and you know it. We won't forget this. I turned my phone off, but the next morning, I woke up to even more messages. Missed calls. Voicemails I didn't bother listening to. It was the same old pattern. Push, push, push until I caved. Except this time, I wasn't going to. Then my bank called. It was a fraud alert. Someone had tried to access my account. At first, I assumed it was just a random scam, but then the fraud department told me that the person had my full social security number, my mother's maiden name, and even the answers to my security questions. My stomach dropped. The only people who knew that information were my parents and Ethan. I felt physically sick. I asked if any money had been transferred, but the bank had flagged the attempt as suspicious and blocked it before anything went through. I locked down my account, changed all my passwords, and added extra security layers. Then I just sat there, staring at my phone, debating whether I should call my parents or Ethan directly. I didn't have to. A few hours later, my Aunt Karen called. She was one of the only people in my family I still trusted. When I picked up, she sounded tense. Are you okay? I frowned. Yeah, why? She hesitated. Your parents have been calling everyone, telling them you abandoned Ethan in a life-or-death situation. I exhaled sharply. Of course they were. They said he's in immediate danger, she continued, and that you refuse to help because you're too obsessed with money. I laughed. A hollow, bitter laugh. Did they mention the part where he tried to hack into my bank account? Silence. What? She finally said. So I told her everything. The bank fraud attempt. The texts. The fact that Ethan had spent years leeching off our parents while I worked my ass off to build a life for myself. When I finished, she let out a long breath. I knew they favored him, but I didn't realize it was this bad. Then she told me something that made my blood run cold. Ethan had been borrowing from everyone. Over the last 6 months, he had asked multiple relatives for money, each time with a different story. He told my grandmother he needed cash for medical bills. He told my cousin Ryan it was for a business investment. He told my Uncle James his car got stolen, and he needed help getting a new one. All lies. And then Karen dropped the biggest bombshell. Did you know he tried to take out a loan under Uncle Greg's name? I gripped the phone tighter. What? Greg got a notification about a loan application he never made. When he looked into it, it was traced back to Ethan. Your parents convinced him not to press charges because he didn't mean any harm. I felt physically sick. This wasn't just irresponsibility anymore. This wasn't just Ethan being immature or making bad choices. This was fraud, theft, and my parents had been covering for him. Karen sighed. Look, I don't know what you're planning to do, but you should know, this isn't going to stop. If he tried to take money from Greg, he's going to try again. And next time, it might not be just your bank account. I thanked her and hung up, my hands shaking. This was worse than I had ever imagined. Ethan wasn't just bad with money. He was a liar, a manipulator, a criminal. And my parents? They were still trying to protect him. I wasn't going to wait around for whatever came next. The next morning, I called a lawyer. Not to press charges, not yet, but to find out what my options were. Then I reached out to my company's security team to lock down my work accounts, just in case. Finally, I installed cameras around my house. Maybe I was being paranoid. But after everything that had happened, I wasn't taking any chances. And I had this gut feeling that things were about to get worse. I knew my parents wouldn't give up easily, but I didn't expect them to escalate so quickly. At first, it was just the usual. More texts, more voicemails, all filled with guilt-tripping and fake concern. My mom left a particularly dramatic voicemail one night, sobbing about how she couldn't sleep, knowing I was letting Ethan suffer. Then my dad tried a different approach, anger. You're being stubborn and cruel. You have no idea what real family means. Do you really want to be responsible for what happens to your brother? You've made a mistake, and you need to fix it before it's too late. I ignored them. I had nothing left to say. But then things took a turn. It started with an email from my dad. Short, cold, and calculated. The subject line just said, reconsider. Your actions are forcing us to rethink your place in this family. Your mother and I have given you everything. We sacrificed for you, supported you, and helped you become the person you are today. Your success is a direct result of our love and efforts. If you continue to turn your back on your own blood, there will be consequences. Think carefully about your next move. I actually laughed out loud. The sheer audacity of it. They had given me nothing. I had worked for everything I had, while they funneled money and energy into Ethan's endless disasters. And now they were trying to act like my life was somehow theirs to control? I deleted the email without responding. And that's when things got worse. A few days later, Karen called again. Your parents are telling everyone that you're lying about Ethan, she said. They're saying you made up the whole bank fraud thing to justify being selfish. My grip tightened on the phone. Let me guess. They're playing the victims now? Oh yeah. They're telling people you've abandoned them after everything they've done for you. That you're living in luxury while Ethan is struggling just to survive. I sighed. And do people believe them? Karen hesitated. Some do. That stung more than I wanted to admit. My parents had spent years cultivating this perfect image. The loving parents, the struggling but good-hearted son, the successful but ungrateful daughter. They knew exactly how to twist a story to make themselves look like martyrs. But Karen wasn't done. I need to tell you something else, she said. I heard from someone you might want to talk to. Ethan's ex, Rachel. I blinked. Rachel? Why? Because she says Ethan's been acting weird. And he's been talking about you. A chill ran down my spine. He's been saying things like, she'll get what's coming to her, and I'm not gonna let her get away with this. I stood up, my pulse spiking. And you believe him? I don't know. But Rachel sounded freaked out enough to reach out, and I thought you should know. I closed my eyes, exhaling slowly. I shouldn't have been surprised. Ethan had never handled consequences well. He always lashed out, blamed someone else. And now that his usual safety net was gone, he was angry. I wasn't scared of him, but I wasn't about to take any chances either. That weekend, I upgraded my home security. New locks, extra cameras. I told my neighbors to keep an eye out. And then I made a decision. I wasn't just going to wait for the next attack. I was going to end this. I was done waiting for the next hit. If Ethan wanted to play games, I was going to make sure he lost. The next day, I drove to his apartment. It was in a part of town that had definitely seen better days. Cracked sidewalks, overflowing dumpsters, a flickering streetlight that barely lit the entrance. The hallway smelled like stale beer and bad decisions. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again, harder. Finally, the door creaked open, and Ethan stood there, looking like absolute shit. His hair was greasy, his hoodie was stained, and his eyes were cold. He smirked. Took you long enough. I pushed past him into the apartment. The place was a disaster. Pizza boxes stacked in the corner, empty beer bottles on the table, a faint smell of weed hanging in the air. And then I saw it. A pile of mail and credit card statements on the counter. Several of them had different names. My stomach turned. I knew Ethan was reckless, but this wasn't just borrowing money from family. This looked like identity theft. I turned to him. Did you try to steal from me? He rolled his eyes and collapsed onto the couch. Mom and Dad said you'd cave if things got bad enough. I was just speeding things up. My jaw tightened. You don't even care, do you? He stretched lazily, like this was boring him. You'll forgive me. You always do. Something inside me snapped. Not this time, Ethan. My voice was ice. I'm done. I'm not fixing your messes. I'm not bailing you out. And I'm sure as hell not going to let you take what I've worked for. His smirk vanished. You think you're so much better than me, don't you? Before I could answer, the door slammed open. My parents. Of course. Ethan must have texted them the second I arrived. My mom rushed in first, already crying. How could you do this to your own brother? I folded my arms. You mean the brother who tried to hack into my bank account? My dad glared. You have the money. You wouldn't even miss it. I let out a cold laugh. So fraud is fine as long as it's family? Mom wailed. He was desperate. You forced him into this by refusing to help. And that was when I realized they weren't even pretending to be ashamed. They weren't horrified. They weren't angry at him. They still thought this was my fault. I pulled out my phone and hit play. The recording started. Every word, every excuse, every pathetic justification they had just made. The moment they heard their own voices, their faces changed. My dad clenched his fists. My mom's fake tears dried up instantly. And for the first time, Ethan actually looked scared. I stepped forward. This goes straight to the police if anything happens to my accounts again. And I will press charges. Mom gasped. You wouldn't. I smiled. Try me. My dad grabbed my arm as I turned to leave. His voice was low, dangerous. If you walk out that door, don't ever expect to be welcomed back. I met his gaze, calm and steady. That sounds more like a promise than a threat. And then I left. By the time I got home, I had dozens of missed calls and messages. I blocked every single one of them. Then I sat down, opened my laptop, and drafted an email. To every single relative. I attached screenshots of their texts, a transcript of the recording, evidence of the bank fraud attempt. I wasn't going to be their scapegoat anymore. I sent the email that night. No holding back, no sugarcoating. I laid everything out, Ethan's lies, my parents' manipulation, the fraud attempt. I attached screenshots of their texts, the transcript of my recorded conversation, and proof that someone had tried to access my bank account. Then I shut my laptop, silenced my phone, and waited. By morning, my inbox was exploding. Some relatives were horrified. My Aunt Karen responded almost immediately. I knew they treated you unfairly, but I had no idea it was this bad. I'm so sorry you've been dealing with this alone. My cousin Jake, who had never liked my parents much, was blunt. Good. They needed to be exposed. Others, though, weren't so supportive. My Uncle Mark wrote, You didn't have to air family business like this. You've really embarrassed your parents. My grandmother left a voicemail, sobbing. Family isn't supposed to turn on each other like this. You've broken your mother's heart. And then, of course, there were my parents. They completely lost it. My mom's email was pure emotional manipulation. Half guilt, half rage. You don't understand what you've done. You've ruined our reputation. How could you betray your own family like this? My dad's was shorter, colder. You have made your choice. Don't expect to be forgiven. As if I wanted forgiveness from them. But the real fallout came when other victims started speaking up. Within hours, I got a message from my cousin Megan. Ethan told me he needed money for surgery. I gave him $3,000. Are you telling me that was a lie? Then my Aunt Lisa. He convinced me to co-sign a loan. I've been paying it off for over a year because he forgot to make the payments. Even the mystery of the missing jewelry from last Christmas? Suddenly, people were putting the pieces together. But the biggest bombshell came from Ethan's old roommate, Brandon. He saw my email and immediately reached out. I never told anyone this, but Ethan used my identity to open credit cards. I didn't report it because I didn't think anyone would believe me. Your parents always acted like he was a saint. That was the final nail in the coffin. Word spread fast. Someone from the company Ethan had recently interviewed with saw the messages. They started digging into him. Within a week, his job offer was rescinded. My parents? They tried everything to contain the damage. They backpedaled, lied, and begged people not to believe me. But the facts were right there. They couldn't spin their way out of this one. And then, suddenly, they just went silent. No more emails. No more messages. No more phone calls. They had lost. As for Ethan, his landlord evicted him. Turns out, when you have a history of fraud, people don't want you in their building. Last I heard, he was crashing on a friend's couch, scrambling to find a way to pay off his debts. And me? For the first time in my life, I felt free. A month passed, and I didn't hear a word from my parents. No calls, no emails, nothing. It was like they had vanished, or more likely, they had finally realized their guilt-tripping wouldn't work anymore. And I was fine. Better than fine. Without the constant stress of their manipulations, I could finally breathe. My mind was clearer, my energy was better, and for the first time, I felt like I was living my own life, not just surviving their demands. I got a promotion at work. Turns out, when you're not emotionally drained from family drama, you can actually focus. My boss noticed. More responsibility, better pay, a bigger office, all mine. I even started dating again. For years, I avoided relationships because I didn't want anyone dragged into my family's mess. But now, there was no mess. I met someone who respected boundaries, and it took me weeks to stop expecting him to suddenly become another problem I had to fix. Meanwhile, my parents were dealing with their own problems. The social circle they had spent years maintaining? Gone. Turns out, when you spend decades pretending to be perfect parents, people don't take it well when they find out you've been covering for a scammer. The church group they relied on for sympathy? Not returning their calls. My dad's golf buddies suddenly had other plans every week. They had spent so much time controlling the narrative, but now the truth was out. And Ethan? Working 3 jobs trying to keep a roof over his head. No credit, no safety net, no one left to manipulate. For the first time in his life, he had to face the consequences of his own actions. I thought maybe I'd feel something about that. Regret, sadness, maybe even guilt. But I didn't. Because for years, I had been told that family means unconditional support. That no matter what Ethan did, I had to help him. That no matter how much my parents ignored me, dismissed me, or used me, I had to prove myself to them. But family isn't about obligation. It's about respect. And if someone refuses to respect you, whether they share your DNA or not, you don't owe them a damn thing. I used to think cutting off my family would feel like losing something, but it didn't feel like loss. It felt like freedom.